The draft statement for the COP26 climate agreement, called the Glasgow Climate Pact, is what they've settled on, has been released, and COP26 has now been denounced pretty much by all groups as a bit of a failure, although it's being spun as they've kept 1.5 degrees centigrade alive. But rather than read you the statement, I thought I'd read you instead the High Achievement Coalition's statement, which is a group of 61 countries, including the United States and Britain. And it's interesting, their statement. I'm going to read it now. This is the High Achievement Coalition, which is part of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. It was started in 2014 as a way to hold the feet to the fire of the signatories to the Paris Agreement. So here's what they say about the COP26 agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact. Oops, not the right bit. The statement from the High Achievement Coalition. Alarmed by the latest findings of the IPCC that confirm the need for the most ambitious efforts within this decade to enable us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and prevent the most catastrophic climate impacts. So they're alarmed. Okay, good. We welcome the announcements and actions undertaken by the parties, the Conference of Parties people, that are aligned with keeping a 1.5 degrees centigrade limit within reach and promote the achievement of the Paris Agreement temperature goals. Okay. They also note with deep concern the gap between existing commitments and a 1.5 degree centigrade pathway, stress the urgent need to accelerate the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in this decisive decade, and recognise the importance of the ambitious action by the G20, whose members, if they align their policies with a 1.5 degree centigrade pathway, could limit global warming by 2100 to 1.7 degrees centigrade. There's a bit of strangeness about all this idea of limiting warming to so many degrees centigrade. It used to be 2 degrees centigrade was described as the tipping point. What's important to say, and what nobody really talks about, is that there's locked into the system, our climate system, is a certain amount of carbon, so that if we stopped producing carbons right this second, the planet would still warm by a certain amount, maybe half a degree or something, maybe take 50 years. But that's never ever talked about. That's probably why they reduced it from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. I don't actually know the reason for that, but I could look into that. But it's never talked about what the throughput is, we might think of it as. And that's important. It should be talked about. Anyway, the HAC recognises the devastating impact already being felt today by people across the globe and resolve to take urgent action to address the climate crisis. Okay? We recognise the imperative of all countries to adapt to ever-increasing impacts of climate change and the urgent need for a substantial scale-up in accessible adaptation financing to ensure that no one, especially the most vulnerable, is left behind. We recognise the important work of the IPCC and its value as a basis for characterising adaptation needs and strategies, and welcome the upcoming IPCC reports and the consideration of any work as dedicated to adaptation and climate tipping points. Okay, we therefore, so here's what they've resolved to do. This is the HAC stress the need to have global emissions by 2030. Have global emissions by 2030. What based on this emissions currently? Okay, that's going to take us back where we were at 1992, because since 1992 emissions have went up by 50%. Not exactly a success. We've had 26 of these conferences of parties and emissions have went up, not down. So they're not really that successful, are they? Despite all the talk. There is reasons for that. There's reasons. Okay, where was that? They need to have global emissions by 2030 and call on parties that have yet to do so to deliver a more ambitious NDCs. That's nationally determined contributions. Now these whole things are basically fake. They're bullshit. Come on. Nationally determined contributions. What about trade? What about shipping? Aviation? They go on to say a wee bit about that. To deliver more ambitious NDCs, that's nationally determined contributions, in line with the 1.5 degree centigrade trajectory as soon as possible and well ahead of COP27. So ahead of kicking the can down the road to COP27. We call on all parties to deliver a mid-century net zero, notice that phrase, greenhouse gas emissions goals with strategies for their implementation that align with a 1.5 degree centigrade trajectory as soon as possible, in time for the global stocktake term in 2023. Net zero. No, we don't want net zero. We want actual zero. Net zero is a way to do all kinds of false accounting and all kinds of passing of the buck. Net zero is a joke. Net zero involves unproven technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which is basically a joke, and also carbon sequestration, which is a worse joke. In fact, Alex Salmond was on the TV not that long ago saying how we should drill for oil in this Campbell oil field, citing, well, we could do carbon capture and storage. No, we can't. No, we can't. Even if it works as it is promised, what is carbon capture and storage? Well, it's taken the carbons produced where? Is it in your car or a plane? No, it's at a power plant. So something like a coal-fired power plant, you take the carbon out it, you do something chemical with it, and then you put it into some aquifer or something like that, or in some rock formation or at the bottom of the ocean or something. Okay, I'll get a better idea. How's about not taking the oil from the ground in the first place? How's about that? Would that not be better? Anyway, I'm ranting. Where the hell was I? The global stocktake in 2023. Okay, we resolve to deliver on these commitments through national policies that reorient economies towards a low and zero carbon future, including to A. Halt investment in new unabated coal-fired power plants in line with the requirements for a 1.5 degree centigrade trajectory. Halt public funding for all overseas unabated coal projects in the energy sector. B. Halt inefficient fuel subsidies ASAP. Yeah. Sure. Yes. A low carbon and zero carbon future. I wonder if flights are included in that, because we've just had the Chancellor giving a huge tax break for internal flights. Is that a low carbon future? What about planning? Because if you look at planning applications, you find all kinds of roads, all kinds of airports in the planning applications. So how's that going to contribute to a low carbon, zero carbon future? No, I don't think so. I think these things are a bit of a joke. Commit to a collective goal of reducing global methane emissions. These are other greenhouse gases, more potent but usually shorter lasting than carbons, by 30% from 2020 levels by 2030, and take aggressive action to reduce emissions of super pollutants, also including hydrofluorocarbons and black carbon. These are other types of pollutants. Okay, it's a goal. I'm not actually sure about the efficacy of that. Need to look it up. So don't know so much about that. Support, this is D, support ambitious policies to reduce emissions in the transport sector. Okay, including the what the hell, what have I wrote here? To, I think that means, take more ambitious climate action in shipping and aviation. Oh, what a commitment that is. Take more ambitious climate action in shipping and aviation. These things are not even included in the nationally determined contributions. What action exactly? You mean the tax break that was just given? Oh, jeez, oh man. This is number 10. We call on parties to prepare and submit national adaptation plans to communicate in time for their consideration in the global stocktake. That's that thing that's happening in 2023. Recognise the importance and support for and international cooperation on adaptation efforts, taking into account the needs of developing country parties, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Notice what is missing. Well, they just go into this. The money. And something else I'm going to get to as well. We call on all developed countries to deliver the goal of mobilising 100 billion annually to 2025. Where is the money? The 100 billion a year was promised, it was never delivered. Some was delivered, 80 billion, it's supposed to be 100 billion a year. Cumulatively, that is a lot of money. I've not calculated how much it is, but it's a lot that's missing. In 2020, annually to 2025, on the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation. Nothing for loss and damage. They did mention it, but basically nothing for loss and damage, which the poorer countries have been calling for. Money for loss, talking about trillions here for loss and damage. Not just mitigation, not just adaptation. Part of it, but we need money for loss and damage. Okay, number 12. We welcome the efforts of those countries that have stepped up their adaptation finance to a balance with mitigation financing, and call on those who have not yet done so to address the adaptation finance gap by scaling up to double the current levels. No, it's still nowhere near enough. You're talking about they need trillions, these poorer countries, and for loss and damage, for adaptation and mitigation. But fundamentally, notice how there's no call for it to an end to endless growth. There's no call, there's no talk about any what's actually sustainable and what we could actually do to say, I don't know, have move people from cars, say, into a mass transit system. Nothing about this anyway. Anyway, it just shows these vague targets are a wee bit of a joke, and all these nationally determined contributions are just a way to do false accounting and to shift the burden of responsibility onto the global south. That's all they are. Okay, number 13. We reiterate our commitment to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, and commit to initiating deliberations for a post-2025 finance goal based on the best available science, an assessment of the needs and priorities of developing countries, and lessons from the 100 billion goal, with the objection, I think that means the 100 billion was promised, was not delivered, and looking at the lessons of that, I think that's what that means. With the objective of having a maximum impact. We also encourage the development of new financial instruments, taking into account the need for more consistent and reliable financing streams, and call for the scaling up of private sector finance. Wishful thinking and vague, so not exactly being really exact about anything, just saying, well, we hope private finance will give the money, and not actually saying, well, here's who's going to give what, here's exactly how it happens. Just that we hope there's extra, better financing streams, etc. Okay, number 14. We acknowledge that loss and damage, right? Okay, including slow onset events, has already been experienced in all countries and regions, but especially in vulnerable places. Okay, so give the money then. We call for enhanced interventions in relevant fields and recognise the need to increase the resources for averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage. So basically nothing. They've got nothing for loss and damage. Number 15, we call for the finalisation of negotiations and outstanding elements of the Paris Agreement rulebook in full accordance with environmental integrity, transparency and accountability. A bit of a damp squib called Weak and Meek by Greenpeace. Well, that's what the High Achievement Coalition set up to make sure the Paris Accords were put into effect. There's a whole bunch of countries that's in it. Paraguay, Honduras. Did they not have a coup about 10 years ago supported by the United States? Interesting. Barbados, Panama, a whole bunch of different countries. Bhutan, Italy, Ireland, Uruguay, Switzerland, European countries, and New Zealand. No Russia, no China, no India, and this High Achievement Coalition was set up in 2014 or 13. So this agreement that's coming out for the COP26 called the Glasgow Climate Pact, it's basically a damp squib. None of the civil society organisations think it's any good. It's going to be spun as keeping 1.5 degrees alive, meaning the average yearly global temperature rises, keeping them to 1.5 degrees to prevent a tipping point being reached in those kinds of positive feedback loops and unstoppable runaway climate change. Being described by Ashok Sharma, the negotiator, so it's not Boris that's doing the negotiations, Ashok Sharma. History has been made. The only history that's been made is the historically large numbers of dead folk thanks to the pandemic. Pandemic's actually a good indicator of how the globe can work together. Badly, very badly. Almost 10,000 people died. Scotland with the pandemic, 143,000. Britain, 760,000 in the United States. And that's the guts. 1 million people just in the 3 countries alone. And these are the people who's going to work together, these same politicians. And that's not to mention the industry HACs who all went to the climate conference wringing their hands, pretending that they can't do anything. Remember that these nationally determined contributions and highfalutin words come out at the same time as you're getting politicians who say we should drill for oil in the Campbell oil field. It's madness. It's crazy. Yeah. So that's the High Achievement Coalition statement on the COP26 agreement. Okay.